This next session is one that has become a standard at the Institute and one that I've had the honor of leading in the past. I'm pleased to introduce our session chair for the Recurring Disclosure Challenges panel, PJ Himmelfarb. PJ is a partner at Weil's Public Company Advisory Group. PJ advises public companies on a day-to-day basis on disclosure issues, securities law compliance, key risk areas including cybersecurity and ESG and sustainability, restatements and internal control issues, exec comp and proxy advisory firm policies, and board-related issues such as director independence and refreshment. Prior to joining Weil, PJ was special counsel in the SEC's Office of Chief Counsel and also in the Office of Mergers and Acquisitions in the Division of Corporation Finance. PJ, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. I am delighted to chair. I have big shoes to fill with Tom, having done it before, the Recurring Disclosure Challenges. And we don't have a story like here about 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. That was so great yesterday. Some of us, most of us have been on this panel repeatedly, so we've kind of bonded on figuring out the unanswerable or doing our best to tell you what we think. And some of the things we picked to talk about today are things that Eric and Cicely and Michael just said, more guidance is coming. So we wish we had the benefit of that, but we'll tell you our best view. So I'm delighted to be joined. This year we have an in-house presence, and we're excited about that. Rob Beard, who's to my immediate left and is the Senior Vice President and General Counsel of Micron Technology. And then we have Liz Morgan, who's with King & Spalding, a partner with King & Spalding. Christina Thomas, who's with Kirkland & Ellis. And Marco Zitelny, I said it wrong, Zitelny. I was trying so hard. With Ropes & Gray. So we decided to continue in Tom's path of doing this by hypotheticals. And we hope that you'll enjoy them. We think that instead of going through the rule says this, the rule says that, the rule says this, we will be incorporating that into our hypo, and I hope that makes it more practical for you. We're starting with pay versus performance. Before this morning, I don't think anybody had mentioned that one yet. And while we hope to get guidance soon, I think a lot of our clients are working on this already. So we wanted to give you some advice through the hypo on that. And basically, most of you, or most companies that are calendar year, fiscal year end, will have to have this in your 2023 proxy statement. So while we haven't talked about it much at this conference, you've probably been hearing about it internally and working with comp consultants and valuation experts. And so it starts out for this year with 3 years for most companies, but it'll go to 5. So I'm not going to spend much time on this. The key is when you're listening to our hypo, the rule is to disclose the relationship between financial performance and compensation actually paid to the principal executive officer and on average the NEOs as a group. And the devil is in the details. What you'll hear us talk about is, well, what is actually paid and what do we put in the table for one of the requirements being the most important company selected measure. And another column in the table is TSR of peers. Who do you pick? Do you pick the performance graph peers or the CD&A peers? So we'll get into that now, and I will turn it over to Christina.
Thank you so much, PJ, and thank you also for all of the hard work you put into coming up with these amazing hypotheticals. So, okay, we're going to start with Hypo 1. XYZ is hiring a new CEO, Paul V. Page. XYZ has proposed linking Paul's compensation to their TSR under his proposed employment agreement. In order to take this role, Paul is leaving XYZ's biggest competitor, where his pay is based on relevant retail industry metrics such as same-store sales growth. Paul will not take the job with XYZ if they insist on tying his compensation to TSR thresholds, since he believes TSR is not an appropriate metric for determining true value delivered to shareholders in the long term. Should XYZ hold firmly in its negotiations, knowing that TSR is an important part of the new PVP disclosure rule, or should it base Paul's compensation on different metrics? So I'm going to turn it to my panelists first to get us started.
Well, first of all, you're negotiating with the CEO, and so I think that there are two layers to this, right? Hopefully nobody's going to be negotiating employment agreements based on what the disclosure is going to say
Right.
about it. But you still have to think about it in the context of, number one, the number one goal is recruiting the CEO, and what are you going to do in order to make sure that he joins? But number two, I think what the pay versus performance rules are designed to do is to make sure that when you go through the various steps of designing compensation, and here's a step in terms of negotiating the employment arrangement, what are the pay versus performance considerations, and how should those be taken into account? And so we'll see later in the hypo that, there's a potential divergence, but I think it still has to be in your mind when you're negotiating these things.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think before I just say no, I would want to understand more about why the company is suggesting to tie his comp to TSR. Is there a reason here other than the pay versus performance new rule? But otherwise, I think if Eric Girding were on this panel, he would make the point that this is a disclosure rule. It's not prescriptive, and there's no requirement under the rule to actually tie comp to TSR.
Right, I'm interested to know, and it's not in the hypothetical, but was the former CEO or the other NEOs, are they compensated based on TSR? Or is this really just, we've got this new pay versus performance rule, TSR is going to be in the spotlight, let's start moving in that direction. So is the rule prompting the company's proposal? And as you alluded to, it should not be.
Yeah, well, and sitting with our comp committee and thinking about, as they think about how they're going to compensate our senior executives, it's something that's always in our minds, right? And in the comp committee's mind is what's the right metric for evaluating this person's performance and compensating them? And for some people, that TSR, RTSR, that's going to be really important. For other companies in different industries or where you have particular things, you're also thinking about sort of where in this life cycle and stage is this company. What are you bringing this person in to do, and what is it that you want to drive with them? And so I can tell you that the disclosure and what this is going to look like from a disclosure perspective is in the minds of a lot of comp committees when they're setting compensation. But it's not, in my experience so far, it hasn't been a driving force. It's just more of the driving force is, what do we need this person to do? Why are they bringing them here? And in the background, there's always this sort of element of, what's this going to look like, right? And I think it's important to think about what's this going to look like. Not let that drive your decision, but it is an important consideration.
Okay, so let's say that XYZ takes our advice and says, okay, we really want this CEO. We're not going to let this kill the deal. So they agree with Paul. They say, well, okay, we'll link your compensation to same-store sales growth. So the compensation of all of the other NEOs at XYZ is linked to their net income under their employment agreements. If that's the case, how would you determine which is the company's most important when you're reporting pay versus performance?
I think there's a technical point here, which is if net income is the most important measure, that's already one of the required columns in the table, so you'd have to select the next most important measure.
Yes, that was actually a hidden trick in our hypo.
How many of you got that?
You had to be paying attention for that one.
The other issue that came up when we were discussing this is, let's assume that we think it's same-store sales growth. And if you think to how companies disclose that now, most companies take the position that that is a metric versus a non-GAAP measure. And so they take it outside of non-GAAP measure. They treat it as a metric. The SEC has guidance that is comfortable with that. But the most important metric for purposes of this table has to be a financial measure. And so it's not certain that same-store sales growth is a financial measure that meets the criteria of that column. And so you'd have to figure out whether that's a good enough answer for purposes of your disclosure.
Another question I've been hearing a lot about is, can you use stock price? And I think that's being hotly debated amongst consultants and advisors, and so look out for more guidance. But I am hearing some companies who think stock price is the most important measure, planning to use it. We'll see what happens.
Okay.
Well,
yeah. go on.
So otherwise, I mean, I think maybe there's an open question here. If you are faced with two metrics, how do you decide which one is more important? And I think what I've been seeing most of the time, the answer is pretty obvious. But if it's not, I'd be looking at the LTIP and also the short-term plan for synergies between those two. And if there's no formal weighting, going back and looking at the comp committee materials, and is there any kind of informal weighting?
And that's exactly what I was thinking as we first started discussing this hypo. I'm thinking about, okay, what is Micron's LTIP, right? Because the LTIP tells us a lot about what we were thinking about when we're thinking about how are you going to compensate the senior management team. That tells us what we're really driving the company toward, and if that's what we're driving the company toward, then that's a really important financial metric. And so I do think a reference to that is useful and helpful. Hopefully too, your compensation committees have a strong record of, and we do this every year, of going back through with the comp consultant, what are we trying to drive to? What are the important metrics for this company? What are the important financial elements that we're going to consider when we compensate people? And so hopefully you've got a nice record of that discussion that you can then rely back on, and that's sort of how I'm intending to do it.
And I think these are a lot of first-year questions, right?
Absolutely.
Like there's a lot to sort out right now, and then hopefully it gets a little more routine as the years progress.
I was really relieved to hear the staff say there will be no gotchas. We're going to hold them to that. The other thing I've been hearing is companies saying, well, okay, we picked our most important company-selected measure, but that's for 2022, and we use something different for 2021 and 2020. What do we do? And the rules say that you have to do it for all 3 years, and that's complicated. So I don't know if there will be any further guidance on that.
And that's going to be an interesting one, right? Because your STIP and LTIP change, year over year sometimes, and so you might not have consistent goals over the 3 years. So referencing back to that may be a bit of a challenge too.
So PJ, in those situations, have you been recommending that people include footnote or narrative disclosure?
Yes. So I'm a little nervous because I'm sure Eric and company are still, but we first start out with you should use the same metric for all 3 years because that's what it says in the rule. If that is somehow impractical or impossible, then certainly we would say use the most important for 2022 and then disclose what the difficulties were and what you're using for 2021 and 2020. That is not officially sanctioned, though. So.
All right, so now that we're in the weeds, getting all the information for the table, let's talk about calculating compensation actually paid. What advice do my panelists have for companies specifically XYZ, as they're figuring that out?
Well, hopefully they're already done.
Thank you, Liz.
No, and I would say as you're going through the process to think about building out methods for doing the recalculations going forward. So assessing whether you need to build out new controls that will be in place for next year so you can run these calculations on a more automated basis.
Yeah, one thing that's a little confusing in this table is, we've gotten used to summary comp table that must be under the SEC view actually paid, but there's adjustments. So there's a column for total from the summary comp table, and then there's a column for the adjusted compensation.
Right, and I would say, to the legal team, just as you pull in others to help with your summary comp table, bring in your HR, your accounting, your pension plan actuary or plan administrator if you have one to figure this out as well, because you're going to need people to help run those numbers, and I think it's going to be a variety of people within the building to help with that.
I think the other thing that I think may be useful is to sort of do this on a rolling basis throughout the year, so that you're not at the end of the year and you have sort of a gotcha moment, or this is not what we thought it was going to be sort of moment. You'll hear me say that too when we talk about perks, but You know, keeping a record of that and reporting it out to the comp committee on a quarterly basis is something I think would be really, really helpful.
And I wanted to turn to the peer group question, right? Because you get a little bit of optionality in the rule. You can choose your performance peer group or your compensation peer group. So what advice are you giving to clients on how to make that decision?
There's one watch out on the compensation peer group, which is that tends to be quite fluid. I don't know how often companies are, find themselves rebuilding that group. But every time you rebuild it, now you've got a different calculation, and you're going to be showing, I think, two calculations every year. You have to change it, and so that in and of itself might push people to the 201 performance graph. And the other thing, sitting in comp committee meetings and going through compensation peer groups, you're not really looking at their returns and making decisions on that basis, right? It's looking more purely at compensation numbers. And so, how to integrate that into the thinking and whether that actually becomes part of what you're trying to design in terms of compensation, I guess, is an open question that the rules might drive at, but that it just hasn't really been part of what you do with that data.
That's true. I mean, when I first started thinking about that, we'd have to reconstitute that data. That's not what you give the comp committee, right? And so you have to give it a lot of thought if that's the group you want to go with, particularly given the challenges of where you are changing, with many compensation committees will change their peer group, will tweak it every year, every other year. And of course you have changes as a result of consolidation, other activities that's going on in the world as well. So getting something a little more static is certainly going to be easier, but also thinking about whose performance are you trying to measure against. It's a slightly different consideration than who are you competing for talent with.
And Rob, can I keep the spotlight on you for a minute and ask about shareholder engagement, right? I think you're best positioned on this panel to answer sort of, how do you see that playing a role here?
Yeah, well, for sure. And I think that's why I focus so much on kind of keeping this going on a rolling basis because, our shareholder engagement program is pretty strong. We like to talk to our shareholders throughout the course of the year, and we designed a shareholder engagement program around our last proxy voting cycle and who do we need to go talk to help them understand our pay for performance philosophy and all of the elements of it. And so I think keeping them sort of apprised as to what you're thinking about and hearing them. So the way that we do it is, soon after our annual meeting, we go listen to everybody who voted no. And we ask them why, and we hear from them, and we take their feedback, and then we meet with the comp committee, and we think about what is our outreach strategy going to be this summer. And Micron is off cycles, right? So one of the things I meant to say is I'm grateful that Micron is off cycle because I get to see all of you deal with this for a year before I have to even really deal with it. So then in the summer we go back, we plan our outreach, and this, I think, in this next cycle is going to be really important, is to start sort of socializing with them how you're thinking about this and how the compensation committee is using the new rules to, sort of further refine their thinking about pay for performance, how they're going to use those, all of these different considerations, and then ultimately giving them just a little peek into the compensation committee's thought process to why we're making certain decisions. And I think that's really important because they need to your shareholders and the people who are going to be ultimately voting on, say, on pay, for example, they need to understand in an ideal world why you're doing what you're doing, why you make certain choices, and you can then hear them and their feedback on that. And so for us, that's going to be a big part of this is having that engagement with our shareholders and helping them see what considerations we're thinking about.
Thank you for that perspective.
So I'm going to interrupt because almost every year we've had perks at the end and we never get to it. So I think that perks is important. We're going to try to keep on schedule. And this next one may be a tough one and will take a little bit of extra time. So we're talking about board qualifications and selecting from candidates that are available. And I think this is a really tough one. There's all different stakeholders right now. There's the SEC asking, I know it's not nudging, but asking potentially if the rules get adopted as proposed for whether you have cyber and climate change expertise and what is expertise in those areas. But and you have the diversity pressures and the NASDAQ and the NYSE. And so we just thought this was a really good hypo to talk about here. So Marco?
Yep, thanks. One other note, like I think what we have here is quite a complex layer of considerations, right? Because it's not just that there are diversity considerations that the board is asked to consider, but skills and whether directors need to have very specific skills on top of what directors and boards need overall, which is they need to be able to effectively manage and oversee the operations of a company and deliver value to shareholders. And so I think that what tends to happen, or what you can see happen, is when things get overly complex and you've got this matrix of considerations, what do? You start to break it into its, discrete parts. And then you find yourself talking about whether a director is a good addition to the board because of a particular diversity consideration, for example. And that can seem a little bit unsettling when you're discussing it in the boardroom. But we're going to take it on anyway, and we're going to sort of layer out a hypothetical that puts a bunch of these considerations into play and see where we go. So with that said, hypothetical number 2. The CFO of ABC Co. has recently resigned, and an interim CFO has been appointed. 2 of the 9 board members, one of which was chair of the comp committee and the other chair of the audit committee, have retired from ABC's board over the last 2 years, suggesting perhaps some of the leaders of the board have moved on. Both were former public company CEOs. And then ABC filled those vacancies with males with expertise in cybersecurity and tech, but who didn't meet any diversity category. Moving on, another director plans to retire this year, leaving ABC with a vacancy on its board. The board currently has 2 women and 7 men, and 2 of the directors identify as racially and ethnically diverse. Each member of the board's NomGov committee advocates for different candidates. So let's take a look at those candidates. So candidate number 1, Callahan, is an Asian American woman and former chief supply officer of a major retail company. You can read along with me. The one thing to note is that there's not, ABC does not have a large supply chain in its business. And so then moving on to number 2, NomGov committee member number 2 has 2 candidates focused on the CFO transition. One of them, Oslo, is a current company CFO and is already on one public company board and on its audit committee. And then Fred Oppenheimer is option number 2, a former public company CFO who retired 10 years ago and has no board experience so far. NomGov committee member number 3 has brought to the table Charles Campbell, who has ESG expertise. And looking ahead, the question is, are we going to need to have specific ESG expertise on our board, and would it be a good idea to try and bring that on in advance of any specific requirement? So we have those 4 candidates, and we've got to help the board sort this out. First question: how should legal counsel assist the committee in determining which candidate to nominate?
So I'm happy to start this one off. So I think that, they're coming to us as legal counsel, so of course we have to start with some legal advice, right? What do your state law requirements say? What do your listing rules say? Are you satisfying all of those requirements? And then let's start looking at the company's internal documents. What does your committee charter say? What relevant policies or guidelines have you adopted? Do you have a skills matrix that you have missing categories and you need to fill those? And then what do your investors say? And then what do ISS and Glass Lewis say about your current board composition, right? You have to really get the full picture, and I think that goes beyond the sort of strictly legal questions of are you satisfying your listing requirements and your state law requirements?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's so many practical considerations. I'm a huge advocate of the skills matrix and reviewing the skills matrix proactively with the board, and particularly in the NOM governance committee. And I think that proactive creation of the skills matrix and I would say sort of tending to it over time can alleviate some of these, this hypo from ever existing in the first place. And that's something that we really try to focus on is constantly evaluating that skills matrix and asking ourselves, are the skills that we've identified the right ones? Have they changed in some way? And then where do we have the gaps? And so then we can sort of always be in the market for directors. And that's something that's really helped us is that we know what skills we try to know what skills we think we're going to need in the future, and we can target those particular skills when we go out and talk to the recruiters and they bring us candidates. And we'll interview candidates sort of throughout the year, and it just to kind of get to know people so that when we get to the time where we either decide we want to add someone or we have a refreshment opportunity, we know what skills we're looking for, we know who have those skills, and we know who we could go to right away. And so I think that upkeep of that skills matrix, constant upkeep of that skills matrix is a huge benefit in before you get to a situation like this and even preventing a situation like this.
And do you guys find that the board evaluation process really helps with this as well?
The self-evaluation process?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think it does, to be honest. I worry that the board's self-evaluation process is something that they view as being fraught, right? And so they're always wondering, like, how do we do this in a way that minimizes legal risk or doesn't offend our board members? And so some boards do it very effectively, but it tends to be like, how is the board doing generally in terms of the atmosphere of the board, rather than really sort of doing a good job in identifying these kinds of things.
Well, I guess what I was thinking of is a board evaluation process with a third party, because I know we've done them and I find it really useful. And when you talk and you don't have like check the box, numbers to assign how well the board is doing, you can really find out what the board truly thinks the gaps are. So that's what
I think that's right. I think it can help to identify the gaps, and it can also help to zero in on this question of what do the directors think are the biggest risks facing the company, which then you can flip on its side and go back and look at the skills matrix and move forward in that direction.
I think you have to drive the discussion less about how individual members of the board are performing, because that's what that evaluation tends to end up looking like, right? And instead it needs to be, I kind of think about like all the board members are performing well. Let's assume we're all performing well. Where do we have a gap still? What skill don't we have here that we think we might need in the future? Those are pretty good conversations, I think.
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway from this hypothetical for me is like the complexity that boards face now means that they have to be thinking more like you're describing, Rob, where they can't be reactive. If you're going to just be purely reactive, then you're going to get into a situation which we see in the hypothetical, where you have 3 different directors butting heads about who the right candidate should be, rather than making sure that in advance you're taking the time to align on what the needs are for the board and how to prioritize different things and how to make these tough decisions. So
one thing we didn't mention here is competition for good board members is fierce. And if you get yourself into a situation where you need a board member and you're now going out, it can be very hard to find somebody that meets even any of the boxes you want to tick.
You're going to say something?
And I'm sorry, I was just going to say another pressure. Some companies may have gotten a letter from the New York City comptroller who is trying to get companies to apply the Rooney Rule, which is from football, but in this case is to make sure that there's a diverse pool of candidates that you're choosing from.
Okay, on the skills matrix itself, what kind of questions should be asking? What are the watch-outs in terms of thinking about a skills matrix?
Well, that's a great question for Rob.
I was just going to say, I want the legal advice on this. Give you practical advice. So I think I can tell you a little bit about our process, and it may be good, it may be bad. One of the things that we do, and I have really, really great board members here who help drive this process. Our board chair, Bob Switz, is very involved in this, and our governance committee chair, Marianne Wright, is very involved in this and very proactive here. But one of the things that we do when we think about our skills matrix actually is we go back to our risk factors. And we ask ourselves, so that's one element, is where are risks in this company? What are the big risks for the company? And do we have directors who understand those risks and can help us, right? So that's number one. I think number two, then, it's also a discussion with what I'll call the chief business officer role at our company, but the businesses, the different business units, and some of the areas where they see our products going into the future, some of the different types of places where we might need to know a little bit more about the market than we do today, and what directors can actually provide us some direction. So I can give you a great example. I just mentioned Marianne Wright. She comes from the auto industry. You know, a few years ago, Micron was thinking about how do we get more into the automotive industry, how do we know more about that. We started building out that business more, and when we were out sort of in the cycle looking for a director and we talked to Marianne, she had a lot of great skills that were important for our board. She also had a lot of experience in the auto industry. And it's great because when the business units come in and present to the board about our business strategy and business plans, we have that discussion, Marianne can talk about things that can give them advice and help them with things that we're thinking about from a strategic perspective to get into the auto industry. So I think going back and thinking about your business, where you are today, where you're going in the future, and then also thinking about what are the risks to this company and who can we get that can help us identify those risks better and mitigate them and work our way around them. That's the process we've used.
That sounds like a great process to me. Other companies, I fear, sometimes I get it to review, and I don't think that kind of thought was put into it. And then sometimes as legal counsel, you find something that just from a fresh view, like every director checked this box, but one director didn't check that box, and it's a question of, is that person truly doesn't have that skill when everybody else is saying that they do, or no boxes are checked for a particular, or one person, but as outside counsel that there are more directors that could be named for that skill. So I think legal counsel can help with the skills matrix.
Because this is a panel about disclosures, I might take this in a slightly different direction. So this year, because of universal proxy, I think people are talking a lot how there's going to be more focus on individual director qualifications. And so in addition to looking at the skills matrix, I think we're paying a lot of attention to director bios and making sure that the disclosure around what this person brings to the board is very clear there and can tie to what we've checked on the skills matrix.
Yeah, I think that sometimes was a little bit more perfunctory in the past, and
Yeah.
that bio is going to become much more important, I think, with universal proxy card.
Agreed.
Just one legal footnote on the skills matrix or the D&O questionnaire. I wouldn't hesitate to run your D&O questionnaires by your litigators. The D&O questionnaires are produced in 220 demands all the time, and like the problem that you highlight, PJ, like what if you say like, check the box if you have cyber expertise, and nobody checks the box, and then you're dealing with a 220 demand about a cyber incident. You don't want to have to defend, well, we thought that they should have the expertise, but nobody checked the box. And so you have to be mindful about, how you're asking the questions, even as you gather the information.
Did I go too far, or are we on this slide?
I think we had one more question on the prior slide, which is how, so the board realizes that it no longer has an audit committee financial expert. So all of a sudden the choices are narrowed. How should the board go about choosing as between the two potential audit committee financial experts?
I think there are really two questions here, and I think it's, it mentions in the question that Frank Oslo, who's a current CFO, may be preoccupied, but Fred Oppenheimer has all the time in the world, right? So I guess, the first question is, well, how do these individuals feel about the time that they can dedicate to this board? But then the second question is, and again, this was part of the initial legal advice of looking through, what investors' preferences are, their voting patterns, what the proxy advisor voting standards are. Is this something where, the company's going to get dinged because this person is overboarded by either the institutional investor standards or the proxy advisor standards? So it's really, and we talked about and Marco, you actually went through this exercise of making a chart and saying, all right, who are your biggest investors? What about the proxy advisors? Let's fit in this guy's description and see, is he overboarded by any of those standards?
Yeah, because some of the big investors have even more restrictive overboarding standards. And we purposely put in a candidate who was the CFO and already on another board. So that's clearly going to be a consideration.
Okay, so I think that does take us to our next page. So assuming no obvious skills gaps, how does legal counsel help ABC take diversity into account in board composition?
Well, I think obviously that's an important consideration. So if there are no other, I think that's going to be part of the discussion, whether there are skill gaps or not. I think that's an important consideration. We did, I think, give this board some diversity in our hypo, saying there were 2 women and some ethnically, racially diverse. So, but it's, we also mentioned, is it important whether this is NASDAQ or NYC and that kind of thing. So I think diversity has to be one of the considerations. There's the Rooney Rule, and checking to see whether the search, whether you used a good search agent and got the right candidates and had diverse candidates is really important.
Yeah, for me, that's where it starts. We expect our recruiters to bring us a diverse slate of candidates, and for us, we're not often in the position where we're receiving several candidates at once. As I mentioned, out of our processes, we're constantly thinking about it and reviewing people who are out there. But we do expect the people we work with to bring us a diverse slate, and by having that diverse slate, we end up having a better pool from which to choose, and that's I think really, really important. I think there can be sort of a challenge, I think, in sort of chasing diversity at the result rather than in the pool, and I think if you're really good at getting that diverse pool, this is going to sort of sort itself out in the end. But I think you do have to watch and ask yourself, what decisions is the board making over time? Great, we have a diverse pool, but do we have a diverse pool and still choose the same type of person every time? But I do think having that diverse pool and getting exposure to people with lots of different backgrounds who also have the skills you're looking for, it really does enable a better selection and help you build a board that has all those inputs that you're looking for.
And just as a reminder, there are disclosure requirements here. So under 407, you are required to discuss how the NOMCOM considers diversity in the process. And there was a CNDI on this, I think, right before the pandemic that made it clear that if you're considering self-identified diversity characteristics, you're supposed to discuss how they were considered by the committee. And there's a forward-looking piece of this as well. Investors have policies on diversity and qualifications disclosures, and they're looking for companies to really inform shareholders both of their current composition, but also on their strategy going forward. So I think that's important here, and I think there'll just continue to be increased scrutiny around these disclosures and interest in them during shareholder engagement.
Okay, I think, Marco, is there anything else that you want to talk about, because we should move on soon?
Let's just move.
Did we get to everything? Maybe the governance guidelines? Do you guys want to talk about that real quick? Just make sure, we're just talking about governance guidelines, needing to have a fresh look at those to make sure that you have the right provisions in your governance guidelines about these things. Maybe build in, if you decide to, the Rooney Rule, and that'll get you credit for, being thoughtful about these issues. Okay, so our next topic, anything else, guys? No? Okay. Our next topic is SEC comment letters, and on your agenda, it said MD&A, segment reporting, and risk factors. And then I got a call from Mark Cronforst or an email saying, oh, that's our panel, or some of it. So we kind of flipped a little bit, but I will say for MD&A, which is probably the SEC's staff's biggest comment area, as you heard from Cicely, I think, what we're always pushing our clients to do is try to build in the A and the analysis, so it's not just, and for risk factors, the two key ones is not to have risks that make you sound vulnerable to the risk when you're actually experiencing the risk, and also to be more specific to the company. So, but we also had picked up on non-GAAP, and then we heard that Lindsay McCord is going to speak about that, so I won't spend too much time. But I really recommend that you go through the C&DIs. We redlined them just to kind of get what's new and what's not, although you can give it a clean read, but there's some kind of scary stuff in there. I'm sure Lindsay will be talking about it, but one that I think our clients are kind of struggling with, for example, is it used to be, at a long time ago that, as long as you didn't disclose something as non-recurring or unique or one time or whatever, then you were okay to exclude, it. But now the SEC is focusing even on when, you're not doing the bad thing and calling something recurring, non-recurring, that you shouldn't even be using that non-GAAP measure. So we have seen clients successfully write back to the SEC and say, say for litigation expenses, why should you be, adjusting that out? And someone said, well, we have a huge securities class action. We're not adjusting out our regular, litigation expenses. And then there's individually tailored, which has been sort of out there, but there's more examples. I find 100.06 a little scary. Maybe Lindsay will talk about it, which is that, there could be a non-GAAP measure we won't let you use because we think it's, misleading. So we don't know, there were no examples, so we don't know exactly what that is. And there's some nuances in the prominence ones that you should definitely focus on about, a non-GAAP ratio needing to be equally prominent with the GAAP ratio. So hopefully we'll all hear from Lindsay about that later. So I will turn it over to Liz for our climate change comment letter hypo.
Climate change, okay. Well, we can probably go through this one pretty quickly because I know you want to get to perks. Bank ABC has been including generic climate change disclosure in its filing for years. It has never received a comment letter from the SEC, so it continues to copy and paste the prior year's disclosure on potential impact of GHG and acknowledging the risk of climate change impacting its business. Bank ABC is based out of New York and needs to address the NYDFS guidance to update its climate-related risk disclosure. What are your initial suggestions for new disclosure?
You got to stop copying and pasting, right?
Thank you.
The whole point of everything that we're talking about on climate is to move companies away from just assuming that this is boilerplate disclosure that never needs to change, and get them actually to consider what are the transition and physical risks as they relate to our company. And I think it's not easy. A lot of these things are still viewed as long-term, whether they're long-term capital expenditures or other things. And so it does require the investment of effort, but things are not going to change, right? Like we find ourselves in the current environment from a disclosure perspective, and the disclosure is going to continue to be scrutinized, and it's got to get better. And so I think that's going to continue to be the push.
And I think there's been a shift in the last couple of years. Instead of starting with the disclosure, companies are really kind of looking inside first and saying, okay, let's not just create disclosure around whatever we've got going on now. Let's look at, do we need to be doing something differently? Do we need to be doing more? Are we, at what levels are we actually evaluating this? And I think, especially for ABC Bank, it sounds like they're not really going through that exercise, and I think that's where they need to start, and that's going to drive the disclosure.
I think using your ERM process is really helpful here too. In my view, when you think about your risk factors, and I think every company goes through this every year. You evaluate your risk factors and ask yourself, do we have the right risk factors? Are they in the right order? All those fun things like that. I think it's a mistake to start with your last year's risk factors. I think it's much better to start with the risks to the company that have been. Most companies have an ERM process that you've gone through where you've identified the big risks of the company, short-term, long-term, and then go back to your risk factors and say, have we addressed those things? Are we talking about those things adequately? And this one here is particularly challenging, right? It's just in many cases it's so far out and unknown, and I think if you just have boilerplate and continue to reference that boilerplate, you're not doing yourself any favors to think about what is the real risk to the company beyond just what you're going to say, but really evaluating that risk and then translating that into disclosure.
We are actually heavily into helping our clients with 10K season and getting drafts. And I've just been telling our associates, quite often the client will send a red line versus last year's 10K. And saying to everyone, okay, well, you can look at that, but we're 3 quarters, 4 quarters beyond that. And so you have to look at their 10Q from last quarter to kind of see MD&A really isn't that more important to move from that MD&A to this MD&A. So I think companies do sometimes start with last year's and don't do what you do, Rob. So that's good.
Aspirational.
Yeah.
We're veering off track here, but just to double click on that, I think the other thing that I've been doing is going back and listening to the last earnings call along the same lines here as we go into risk factor updating season.
I know we did get off topic, but the fact of the matter is, like anything, climate change, Russia, all of these things, whatever this hypo was, these things that we're talking about, I think relate to any topic that you could have a comment from the SEC about.
I think that's right. Do you want to flip to the next slide?
Oh, sure.
So after ABC filed its 10K, in light of the proposed climate change rule, the SEC staff flooded ABC with comments. Like many other companies this quarter, the staff asked ABC to explain any transition risks related to climate change, including with regard to its assessment of the effect on its business financial condition and results of operations, such as market trends that may alter business opportunities, credit risks, or technological changes. So what types of disclosure might the SEC be looking for here?
So I think before we get into industry-specific disclosure, I think, bigger picture, the SEC staff is looking for companies to be thoughtful about this and to show their work, right? Show that you've been doing the materiality assessment. Even if you come to the conclusion that, this isn't material to us, we don't think there's any additional disclosure we need to provide, you have to go through the analysis, the same analysis you would have anyway, to get to that conclusion. And so I think that the SEC is looking for you to provide them with that analysis and to make sure that it is something that that you've really considered before just coming to the conclusion that you don't have anything new to disclose.
And here, this particular question is about transition risks. And for companies that have put out a sustainability report and include some TCFD analysis in there, and they've gone through scenario analysis, and they have 6 pages on transition risk, I think the company, you need to go through the exercise of looking at that disclosure and translating it into risk factor disclosure for your 10K.
And at this point, I think there is enough guidance out there for you, whether it be the 2010 climate guidance, the guidance that you can pull out of the SEC's proposing release, the NYDFS proposed guidance. There's enough out there to tell you that, for your company, these might be the risks, right? And so if you're not going through the analysis for all of those risks, then you're probably going to get that comment again.
I think something that Liz said is really critical here, and maybe I'll say it a slightly different way, but you have all of these processes working across the company to identify and deal with some of these things. If you let those things operate in silos, you're not going to get the benefit when you're making your disclosure, which means your disclosure won't be as good. So you have to bring those silos into you have to break down those silos and bring them into the process. ERM is important, your sustainability report and team is important, DEI. Those things are really, I think, important to integrate into your risk factors process as well.
The degree of difficulty point strikes me again here, right? Like if you read the DFS disclosure about or guidance about transition risks, it's basically saying, you know, how is this transition environment going to impact your banking customer client relationships, and you know, might it impact their revenue or their costs and change their credit profile? That's a really complicated question for a bank to answer, and certainly a lawyer who helps advise a bank. To me, that means that companies are going to continue to get nudged to go through a difficult exercise. Your sustainability report is a great place to start from an SEC disclosure perspective. We guide our clients not to feel like if one constituency needs to see it, it should be in your 10K. You know, you can rely on them going to your sustainability report for that audience, and so you really can focus on what's material to investors in a 10K disclosure. But like I said, this is not easy disclosure to draft.
And one thing is that if you read the sustainability report and the word material or significant or whatever is used in that report, then there's more pressure, and you may get a comment from the staff on, like, why aren't you being consistent to say that that's material in your 10K? So I think there's a lot of pressure to review that carefully and make sure that you're being consistent. Okay.
So continuing with difficult comments, the ABC responds to the SEC's comment, but the staff reissues a comment letter asking ABC to address the possible indirect financial and operational impacts to it from disruptions to the operations of its customers or suppliers from severe weather. So this is a very narrow comment. It's focused on impacts, physical impacts to customers and suppliers from severe weather. And the question here is, how should the bank respond?
I'm calling PJ. So.
Well, I guess when the staff reissues the comment, one way to respond is to say, you know, potentially to say, we will address anything material that in future filings. So, but I think that's, the staff is obviously pushing the bank to really consider, push harder on whether there are indirect financial and operational impacts. So it's not uncommon to get another comment. If the bank really feels like, you know, they've answered it as best they can and there's nothing further, then you might ask the staff to talk about it further together, you know, to try to figure out what the staff's driving towards. And the other thing, obviously, is to talk internally about whether you have, fulfilled what the staff is asking for, and there's nothing further that you could disclose about indirect impacts.
And I think process-wise for answering these questions, you sort of have to, given the timing where we're expecting the SEC to adopt a climate rule, right? Companies are or should be preparing for that, and it's sort of similar, right? Like looking inside your organization, who from what business unit needs to be involved in these discussions? Do you have a working group that goes across the entire company? And that's probably who should be reading these comments as well and preparing the answers, because if that's who you've got set up to help respond when a new rule is adopted, this is going to be the type of consideration that group is going to have to give. And so I think there needs to be involvement from more than just the legal team in-house and their outside counsel here.
Oh, I think this is non-GAAP. So I think we're going to skip that. Is there anything else?
That was actually the CapEx one.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to go back. I'm
Did you want to
pressing all the buttons and it's not going
She
back.
really wants to get the perks.
It's her polite way of saying move this
let's go to
along.
perks. Let's go to perks.
Okay. Sorry, guys. Okay. So, this one is me. I guess I'm really excited about perks. Sorry.
Sorry, can I just say the one thing on the CapEx?
Sorry.
No,
Yeah.
Because our discussion almost exclusively has been about risks, right, and how to talk about it, and we always go to risk factors. This is a reminder that climate disclosure is not just about beefing up risk factors. It's an invitation to think about CapEx and expenses and other things that may be impacted either by transition or physical risk. And so I think that to do the full job on addressing climate and disclosure, it can't just live in the risk factors.
No, I think that's so important, especially, we don't know, this is a controversial aspect of the SEC's rule proposal, but to the extent you're going to have to, include, aggregating 1% and figure out what impact on the financial statements has a 1% impact, you're going to need to have started thinking about these things. Okay. Perks. Okay. So I don't know about you guys, but these questions come up quite a lot. And the SEC did have an enforcement action in 2020. You can see it for Hilton for failure to, report travel-related perks. So I think it is a complicated area, and I'm just going to go straight to our hypo. So the CEO of XYZ Corp, located in New York, is attending a family reunion in Texas this weekend. She is traveling on Friday and Sunday in order to attend the reunion on Saturday. On Friday, she has a full slate of Zoom meetings and is very concerned about traveling on a commercial airline where she may or may not have Wi-Fi. She discusses this with the GC, and he suggests that she fly on the company plane to be sure that she has Wi-Fi. The GC tells the CEO that this will not be a perk and will not be disclosed in the proxy statement because there is a business purpose for her to use the company plane. So there's a little bit of a trick one in this one. Does anybody want to explain what the trick is in this hypo?
Thanks for the dumb GC joke.
Sorry.
Yeah, Rob, did the GC get that standard right?
That's not what I would say.
No, that's not the right test. I mean, the question is, it's not a perk if it's integrally and directly related to the performance of the exec's duties. So the business purpose is the wrong phrase to be using here.
And I don't know. I don't think it'd be easy to make the argument that this is.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, the business purpose test, I think, is used for taxes and things like that. So it's not crazy. This GC wasn't completely, but it's complicated because of the SEC's test being that it has to be, integrally related to the role. So.
And I think people conflate those all the time, by the way. And I think that SNAP advice, this isn't a really uncommon scenario, I think, for that SNAP advice, because I think that does happen quite a bit, is they conflate those two standards and make a bad call.
Who's going to break it to the CEO that the FAA prohibits the use of Zoom on federal Wi-Fi?
I want to know what Zoom call he's going to have while he's sitting on a commercial airline.
Yeah.
That's another one.
That's not going to last long.
Yeah.
Does that change the business purpose?
No.
No, but we do get questions quite a bit that, all sorts of questions on plane travel. Like, the CEO wants to go to a board meeting, but on the way, he's stopping to pick up his son from college. Or, they're going on a vacation, the CEO's family, but then doing some business during the vacation. And so these are very difficult questions and very facts and circumstances, based, and you need to get to the bottom of it and, find out. You don't want the company to all of a sudden find out at the end of the year that it goes in the proxy as a big perk that won't be looked on favorably.
I think it's a little bit off topic, but that is a really important note, and it goes back to my mantra of making sure this is on a rolling basis. So if the comp committee, for example, has said that you want the CEO or executive staff or whatever to use the plane, for example, in this scenario, should be reporting that out on a rolling basis to the comp committee, and maybe an appendix even just to the comp committee meeting, so they understand what that's going to look like, so there's not a big surprise at the end of the year.
So if this trip is a perk and the bad news was given to the CEO, what would the disclosure look like if the trip costs $8,000, and what would the difference be if it costs $15,000?
Well, first of all, GC's in here. How many of you are going to be the person to give the bad news, Francis?
Nobody.
Yeah, all of us.
Well, I think we need a little more information here, right? Like, are there any other perks during the relevant period? Because if the total value of all the perks to the NEO here is at least $10,000, then there's going to have to be disclosure.
Which I think goes to Rob's point of keeping your comp committee informed on a rolling basis, because then they might be able to say, like, all right, we're pushing 10,000 here,
Yeah.
so let's cool it on the plane travel.
Yeah, and so this was meant to bring up the rule about perks that, if it's less than 10,000, it doesn't even get disclosed, total perks. This one trip plus other trips are probably way over $10,000. And then when you get past the 10,000, there's another test as to whether you just have to give the description, or if you exceed, 25,000, the greater of, or 10% of the total, then you have to give the value. So that's what that was supposed to be. What if the CEO reimburses the company for the cost of the trip? Does that get disclosed, and where, and how is the amount calculated? And what if the total amount of reimbursement for her personal trips is $125,000? Anyone want to discuss this? So, you want me to? I'll keep going. So this is a complicated area. Don't forget that there's a separate rule, right, for related party transactions, and you have to have that approved, and maybe by your audit committee and things like that. So this was supposed to trigger the discussion about related party transactions, and also about calculating, if the CEO is going to pay the company back, they have to pay the aggregate incremental cost. And there's all sorts of issues with figuring that out too. If the company has a plane, do you include servicing the plane? And, so there's a lot of discussions around what the aggregate incremental cost is. But if it's over $120,000, then it does get disclosed in the related party transaction. So that's something to keep an eye on, because if you're trying not to exceed $120,000, or related party is something you should be monitoring quarterly. It's part of your, the auditing standard. The auditor's interested in that as well.
Well, and then you also have to remember that you're going to have to disclose, whether it be the audit committee or another that's in charge of approving related party transactions. How did that process roll out here? Especially if it's incrementally that these costs are coming up, and then at what point are they approving the over $120,000 amount?
Yeah. So we actually got to this early. I didn't manage this well. And so we had talked about, sorry.
There was something I did want to go back to. We didn't get to finish on pay versus performance, and I think it's a really important point. And I can't remember what the question was, but it was the last question, and it was about, it was a catch-all question. What are the other considerations? And this is something we talked a lot about, and I think there has to be a big focus when you're drafting the narrative disclosure, especially for the PVP table. What does it say in your CDNA? Because you don't want inconsistencies there, even if they're perceived inconsistencies, right? And so I think when you're drafting both portions of the proxy statement this year, there really has to be a consideration of, how do we tell this as one complete story?
But you're not putting your PVP in the CDNA, is that right?
Well, the CDNA narrative disclosure versus, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a really important point to make, particularly for companies who historically have disclosed some version of realized or realizable pay, because I think there's a decision to make here. Will we continue to disclose it on that basis as well, and what are we going to say about how that's different than CAP?
Mm-hmm.
I think also it is an integrated story, and being able to tell that integrated story well is going to be really important. particularly, I think one of the things I think about a lot is, as we've started thinking about this, is what if your STI and your LTI goals are very different than the measures that you're putting in the PVP?
Right.
That's a challenge, and it's a storytelling challenge at this point, right? Because you're going to have to be able to explain the comp committee's philosophy and why they've chosen these things versus the things that are in the PVP, and I think that's a challenging but interesting opportunity to really explain the company's pay-for-performance philosophy and how you're going about it. On a related note, something I wanted to talk about is that the table. In the table, you may include non-financial measures as well, which is something I'm looking forward to seeing how you all do it, and then doing it ourselves later. But what are we starting to think about as we start thinking about non-financial measures, particularly because I know a lot of companies use non-financial metrics in their pay, in their LTI or their STI. And for certain companies, I think mine included, where an R&D is a big component, technology milestones are really important.
Now, you're not talking about the first table, you're talking about the second table
second
where
table.
you can list the 3 to 7.
3 to 7.
Yeah, and I think the other topic of discussion in that category is, will companies be listing ESG metrics? Particularly where they have linked pay under a PSU or some other form of comp to an ESG metric. So I think it'll be interesting to see what those tables look like and what, if any, narrative disclosure we see around them.
Yeah, and the way stock price came up was I had a client that has, said really a particular metric is only, 55% or whatever of the compensation. And so that's just one way the compensation is looked at, but there are other ways. And so it really is a complicated process. Anything else you guys want to impart? No?
I'm all out.
Okay. Well, hopefully our hypos were helpful, and if you have any questions, please come up to us, and we're giving you an extra 5 minutes. So I'm supposed to tell everybody that we have a short break and we resume at 10:45. Thank you.
Thank you.